If you're dealing with probate for the first time, the whole process can seem quite complicated, but actually, there are a number of clear stages that most estates will go through. In this video, I'm going to take you through the whole process from what happens after someone dies, right through to paying beneficiaries and completing the estate administration. We'll look at what probate actually is, who is responsible for dealing with the estate, what you need to do first, valuing the estate for inheritance tax, applying for probate, what happens once probate is granted, paying beneficiaries, estate accounts, how long the whole process takes, and what happens when things get complicated. Now, I've divided the video into chapters and I've timestamped each one in the description. So if there's a particular part of the probate process you want to know about, you can jump straight to it just by going to the description and clicking on the section there. However, if probate is completely new to you, I'd suggest starting right here because each stage follows on from the one before it. So let's start with the obvious question. What actually is probate? Probate is one of those words that gets used to mean slightly different things. Strictly speaking, a grant of probate is the legal document issued by the probate registry that confirms the authority of the executors named in a will to deal with the deceased person's estate. But people use the word probate much more broadly to describe the whole process of sorting out somebody's financial affairs after they die. That wider process is called estate administration. It can involve everything from dealing with what the person owed, what they owned, dealing with inheritance tax, applying for the grant itself, collecting or selling assets, paying debts and expenses, preparing estate accounts, and eventually distributing what remains to the beneficiaries. And an important point for beginners is that not every estate actually requires a grant of probate. For example, some assets may pass automatically to a surviving joint owner, and some organisations will release smaller amounts of money without requiring a grant. So, the first question isn't necessarily how do I apply for probate? It's what is in the estate and what actually needs to be done. Who is responsible for the estate? If someone has left a valid will, it will normally name one or more executors. Those executors are responsible for administering the estate. But if there isn't a will, the situation is different. The estate is dealt with under the rules of intestacy, and somebody entitled to deal with the estate can apply to become what is known as an administrator. It's in effect the same as an executor, it's just a different name when there's no will. Instead of getting granted probate in that situation, they will receive something called letters of administration. I've actually made a separate video explaining what happens when someone dies without a will, and I'll link that in the description if that's the situation you're dealing with. You'll sometimes hear the general term personal representative, and that can mean either an executor or an administrator. It's just a general overarching phrase or term. And whichever applies, administering an estate carries real responsibilities. You're not simply dividing up someone's money, you're responsible for identifying and protecting the estate's assets, dealing with debts and tax, keeping appropriate records, and ultimately making sure the correct people receive what they're entitled to. And that's why it's worth understanding the process before you start moving money around or distributing anything at all. What should you do first? One of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking that they need to rush straight into applying for probate. Now, usually there are quite a few things to establish first. You'll need to locate the most recent will, if there is one, and establish who the executors are. You'll also need to start identifying the deceased person's assets and liabilities. Now, that might mean contacting banks, building societies, pension providers, and investment companies. There may be property, vehicles, valuable possessions, or business interests to consider. Now, at the same time, there may be mortgages, loans, credit cards, household bills, and other liabilities. You'll also want to make sure important assets are secure. If there's an empty property, for example, you may need to deal with insurance and make sure the property itself is properly protected. At this stage, you're really building a picture of the estate, and that picture is going to determine much of what happens next. Those are just the the immediate first steps. Now, I've made a separate video talking you through what to do when someone dies in much more detail, and I'll link that in the description below. Valuing the estate. Before you can properly deal with probate, you need to establish what the deceased person owned and what they owed. In simple terms, you're trying to establish the value of the assets, subtract the liabilities, and arrive at the value of the estate. Some things are relatively straightforward. A bank or building society can normally provide the balance of an account at the date of death. Other assets can require more work. So a property, for example, might need to be valued. They may be shares or investments. There might be valuable jewellery, artwork, vehicles, and other possessions. You also need to identify debts and liabilities. And it's important to use values at the date the person died, rather than simply looking at what something happens to be worth several months later, perhaps when you're dealing with it. Now, these figures really matter because they help establish whether inheritance tax is relevant and what information needs to be provided as part of the probate process. For many executors, this information gathering stage is actually one of the biggest pieces of work in the whole administration. I'll be covering some of these individual valuation tasks in more detail in separate videos, because things like valuing a property or personal possessions for probate really deserve explanations of their own. Inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is an area that can look particularly intimidating when you first encounter probate, but not every estate pays inheritance tax. There are various allowances, exemptions, and reliefs which can affect whether tax is due, including provisions relating to spouses, civil partners, and in some circumstances, passing a home to direct descendants. The important thing at this stage is not to assume either that inheritance tax definitely is due or that it definitely isn't. You need to establish the estate's position properly. And depending on the circumstances, information may need to be reported to HMRC, and where inheritance tax is payable, at least some of it will normally need to be paid before the grant can be issued. Inheritance tax can become complicated quite quickly, particularly with larger estates, lifetime gifts, trusts, businesses, or assets outside the UK. Now, if you're dealing with circumstances like those and you're unsure of the tax position, this can be an area where professional advice is sensible. If you would like to speak with a probate solicitor about your situation, there's also a short form linked in the description below. You can complete that and we'll arrange for a solicitor firm to get in touch with you. Applying for probate. Once you've established the necessary information about the estate and dealt with the relevant inheritance tax requirements, you can normally move on to the probate application itself. If you're an executor named in a will, you will usually be applying for a grant of probate. The application provides information about the person who died, the will, the executors, and the estate. You'll also be making a legal statement confirming that the information you provide is true and that you'll administer the estate in accordance with the law. Applications can often be made online, although some circumstances require a paper application, or you may just prefer to make the application in paper, in which case you can absolutely do so. If everything's in order, the probate registry will eventually issue the grant. And this document is important because it provides evidence of the executor's legal authority to deal with the estate. Banks, investment companies, and other organisations may ask to see it before they release substantial assets. But obtaining the grant doesn't mean you've finished administering the estate. In many cases, it means you're moving into the next major stage. What happens after probate is granted? Once you have the grant, you can usually start collecting in the assets that require probate. That could involve closing bank accounts and transferring the money into an executor or estate account. Investments may need to be sold or transferred. Property may need to be sold or transferred to a beneficiary. And money owed to the deceased may need to be collected. But at the same time, the estate's liabilities and administration expenses need to be dealt with, and there can still be tax matters to resolve during the administration period itself. This is why it's really important not to think of the grant as the finishing line. The grant gives you the authority that you need to deal with the assets, and there's often a substantial amount of the estate administration that still needs to be completed. I've got a separate video called After Probate is Granted, 7 Things Every Executor Must Do, and which goes through this stage in much more detail. So what I'll do is I'm going to link that in the description so you can come back to it when you need it. When can you pay the beneficiaries? This is understandably the stage that beneficiaries are usually most interested in. But executors need to be careful about distributing the estate too early. Before making final distributions, you need to be reasonably satisfied that you've identified and collected the estate's assets and dealt with its liabilities, expenses, and tax obligations. You also need to consider whether there are any outstanding claims or other issues that could affect the estate. That's important because if an executor distributes money and subsequently discovers that the estate owes money elsewhere, recovering that money from beneficiaries might not be straightforward. There can be circumstances where interim distributions are appropriate, where part of a beneficiary's inheritance is paid before the administration is completely finished. But you shouldn't distribute money simply because it's sitting in an account and appears to be available. As an executor, you need to know that the estate can afford to make that payment. Now, I've made another video specifically about paying beneficiaries and when it may or may not be safe to do so. Again, I'll link that below rather than trying to cover all of those issues here. Estate accounts. Before an estate is finally distributed, executors should have proper records of what has happened to the estate. These are generally brought together in the estate accounts. Think of them as the financial story of the administration. They show what the deceased owned, what money has come into the estate, what has been paid out, and what remains available for the beneficiaries. For a straightforward estate, the accounts may be relatively simple, but for a complicated estate involving property, sales, investments, income, tax matters, numerous beneficiaries, they can become much more detailed. Now, keeping good records throughout the administration makes it considerably easier when coming to this stage. You can keep statements, invoices, receipts, and records of payments as you go. Trying to reconstruct everything from the bank statements many months later is much harder than keeping proper records from the beginning. Estate accounts are a subject in themselves, so I'm going to be covering those separately in much more detail. And when that video is released, I'll add it to the link in the description in this video that you can also subscribe to ensure you don't miss any future videos. How long does probate take? There's an important distinction here. How long it takes to obtain the grant of probate and how long it takes to administer the entire estate are two different questions. For the entire estate administration, a rough guide for many relatively straightforward estates is somewhere around 6 to 12 months from the date of death. Now, some estates can be completed more quickly than that, while more complicated estates can take considerably longer and sometimes well over a year. And obtaining the grant itself is only one part of that timescale. Even after the grant has been issued, you might still need to sell a property, deal with investments, resolve tax matters, settle debts, and prepare the estate for distribution. A straightforward estate can therefore be completed much more quickly than one involving a difficult property sale, complicated tax affairs, overseas assets, missing beneficiaries, or a dispute. So if somebody comes along to you and says, "Oh, probate takes so and so months," insert number here, do be slightly cautious about that. Now, at the time that I'm recording this video, the government's published figures show that a grant of probate is taking an average of around 5 weeks from submitting the application to the grant being issued. Now, that's an average though. Straightforward applications can be considerably quicker, while applications that are stopped because the probate registry needs further information can take much longer. And remember, getting the grant is only one part of the overall estate administration. which for many straightforward estates, as I've said, take somewhere around 6 to 12 months, and more complex estates can take longer. When does probate become complicated? A lot of estates can be administered perfectly successfully without major problems, but there are situations where things become much more complicated. There might be a disagreement about whether the will is valid. Executors might disagree with one another about administering the estate. A beneficiary may challenge what is happening. Someone who expected to inherit might bring a claim against the estate. And there might be a missing beneficiary, could be of foreign assets, complicated inheritance tax issues, trusts, business assets, or an estate that doesn't have enough money to pay all of its debts. There can also simply be uncertainty about what a will actually means. Now, these are situations where getting appropriate professional advice early can sometimes prevent a relatively manageable issue from turning into a much bigger and more expensive problem. If you are dealing with something like this and you'd like to speak with a probate solicitor, you can use the form I've linked in the description below to arrange for a solicitor firm to get in touch with you. I'll also be adding more videos to this channel dealing specifically with contentious probate, beneficiary problems, and some of these more difficult situations, so do feel free to subscribe. If you are an executor dealing with probate yourself, I've also produced a free guide called 10 Probate Mistakes Executors Must Avoid. It covers 10 of the mistakes executors can make during an estate administration and explains some practical steps you can take to avoid them. It is completely free, and I've put the link near the top of the description below. You can download it and keep it with you as you work through the administration. Hopefully you now have a much clearer picture of how probate and estate administration fit together. You establish who's responsible for the estate, identify and value the assets and liabilities, deal with the inheritance tax position, obtain the grant where one is required, collecting the assets, settle the estate's obligations, prepare the accounts, and ultimately distribute the estate to the beneficiaries. There can be quite a lot involved, but it becomes much easier to understand when you see it as a series of stages rather than one enormous process. You'll find links in the description to more detailed videos I've mentioned, and I'm going to keep adding to those as I cover more parts of the probate process on this channel. But if you've been named as an executor and you're now wondering what you should actually do first, I'd recommend watching the video that I've linked on screen right now.